While a pregnant wife cares for his sick mother, the millionaire husband travels with his mistress. In the upscale neighborhood of Manhattan's Upper East Side, whispers of scandal swirl behind the closed doors of a grand limestone townhouse. Sarah Harrington, tenderly pregnant with her first child, has spent long, sleepless nights nursing her mother-in-law, Margaret, who battles a frail heart condition at Mount Sinai Hospital. Meanwhile, her husband, millionaire mogul James Harrington, jets off with his striking mistress, Cassandra Locke, to luxury resorts around the globe. The tabloids smell blood, close friends murmur in concern, and Sarah, torn between duty and heartbreak, finds herself at a crossroads. In this labyrinth of betrayal and sacrifice, the stage is set for an explosive, life-altering drama. Sarah Harrington never imagined her life would take such a startling turn. Growing up in a middle-class household near Beacon, New York, she had always dreamed of marrying for love and building a warm, stable home something her own parents had managed with modest means. She was bright and hard-working, devouring books about fashion design and interior decorating, intent on one day establishing her own boutique. But fate introduced her to James Harrington, heir to the Harrington real estate fortune, a man whose wealth gave him access to private jets, Manhattan penthouses, and lavish parties that Sarah had only read about in glossy magazines. In the early days of their whirlwind romance, Sarah was enthralled by James's confidence and magnetic charm. He would take her to Michelin-starred restaurants like Le Bernardin or Daniel, gift her delicate Van Cleef and Arpels necklaces, and whisk her away for romantic weekends at the Ritz-Carlton in Paris. Sarah, eyes shimmering with the glow of fresh love, believed she had found a fairy tale. James's mother, Margaret Harrington, a formidable figure in New York's philanthropic circles, greeted Sarah with measured politeness, though beneath that veneer lay an old money skepticism. Still, Margaret managed a polite acceptance, perhaps relieved that her son was finally settling down. When Sarah discovered she was pregnant, James responded with surprising warmth. He talked of building a nursery with the best interior designers, setting aside a trust fund for their future child, and even floated the idea of stepping back from the family empire to spend more time at home. For a fleeting moment, Sarah believed that marriage would cement their bond and that motherhood would usher them into a new, united chapter. But over time, the cracks in James's polished demeanor surfaced. He grew restless, easily bored once the honeymoon phase ebbed away. He was perpetually glued to his phone, texting late into the night, insisting it was just business. His charitable veneer towards Sarah became marked with impatience. He felt stifled by her morning sickness, annoyed when she declined a function or a party because she needed rest. Sarah chalked it up to the demands of his hectic lifestyle, convincing herself that every marriage endured rough patches. Margaret's health took a sharp decline around Sarah's 5th month of pregnancy. A long, undiagnosed heart issue flared, leading to frequent visits to Mount Sinai Hospital. Sarah, heavy with child, was at Margaret's bedside almost daily, holding the older woman's hand through endless medical tests, conferring with cardiologists, and managing the labyrinth of insurance paperwork. James would appear sporadically, breezing in with an armful of pink roses and affectionate words for his mother, then breezing out with phone calls about deals in Dubai or property acquisitions in Milan. Each time, Sarah felt his absence more acutely. It was during one of Margaret's longer hospital stays that rumors first reached Sarah. James had been spotted at the Four Seasons Maui with a leggy brunette who was decidedly not his wife. The initial shock felt like an icy hand around her heart. She tried to push the rumor aside. Maybe it was a business associate. Maybe the tabloids exaggerated. After all, the Harrington name was a magnet for gossip. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and no amount of self-persuasion could quell her growing unease. One morning, Sarah discovered a travel itinerary left carelessly on the dining table of their penthouse, a first-class flight to Tokyo, departing in a week, with 2 seats booked under James Harrington and Cassandra Locke. Sarah's stomach twisted into a nauseating knot that had nothing to do with pregnancy. She knew Cassandra by name, a socialite from London, rumoured to have left a trail of broken hearts and headlines across Europe. The sleek corners of that itinerary cut deeper than any rumour. It was evidence of James's betrayal. And yet Sarah was too stunned to confront him directly. She found herself in a silent whirlwind, trying to protect her unborn child from stress, while grappling with the horrifying revelation that her husband was planning a romantic getaway. To make matters worse, Margaret's condition deteriorated that same afternoon. The phone call from the hospital came just as Sarah was trying to compose herself, instructing her that Margaret's vitals were dipping. Without hesitation, Sarah rushed out of the penthouse, ignoring the itinerary that still lay there on the glossy marble table. The next phase of her life was beginning, one fraught with heartbreak, deception, and a looming question. Could she hold her family together, or would James's betrayal tear them all apart? The days passed in a blur of hospital corridors and hushed late-night phone calls. Margaret's health wavered as doctors deliberated whether to perform a risky valve replacement surgery. Sarah, 6 months pregnant, felt the strain weigh on her body and soul. She spent her mornings attending prenatal checkups at Mount Sinai's maternity ward and afternoons by Margaret's bedside in the cardiac unit 2 floors below. Margaret, once an imperious woman presiding over high society fundraisers for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was now a shadow of her former self. Her once commanding voice trembled with fatigue, her once icy, patrician gaze softened with vulnerability. Sarah discovered an unexpected bond forming between them. Despite Margaret's initial reservations about a middle-class girl, she now clung to Sarah's presence, grateful for any sign of kindness in a world that suddenly felt precarious. Tension at the penthouse escalated. James was rarely home, citing urgent business abroad. He left cryptic messages with the house staff or fired off brief texts to Sarah on flight to Hong Kong. "We'll call soon," but those calls never came. Sarah recognized the name Cassandra Locke popping up in hush-hush conversations among the staff. Some bodyguard or personal assistant would slip and mention Miss Locke, immediately faltering under Sarah's gaze. She gleaned that James and Cassandra were traveling together, hopping from Tokyo to Hong Kong and possibly beyond, chasing business deals, or perhaps just the high of an illicit affair. One drizzly afternoon, as Sarah gently fed Margaret a spoonful of chicken broth, the older woman suddenly clasped Sarah's hand. Her eyes, watery with both medication and fear, searched Sarah's face. "I haven't seen James in over a week," Margaret murmured. "What's happening between you two?" She glanced pointedly at Sarah's belly. "And my grandchild?" Sarah's throat tightened. She debated lying, conjuring an explanation that would soothe Margaret's mind. But something in the older woman's frailty compelled honesty. "He's away, abroad. The doctors thought it was better if you didn't get stressed," she said. The half-truth lingered in the antiseptic air. Margaret's grip weakened. A ghost of understanding flickered in her eyes. "I've known James all his life. He loves excitement, and when something bores him, he moves on quickly." She turned her gaze to the sterile hospital ceiling, fighting back tears. "But he needs to learn responsibility, especially now. I won't let him abandon you." Later that evening, Sarah left the hospital exhausted. The sidewalks glistened with rain, reflecting the neon lights of Manhattan. She craved a hot meal and a moment of solitude, but found her penthouse eerily quiet. The staff had retired for the night, leaving only the low hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen. She ascended the marble staircase to the master bedroom and froze at the sight of a half-packed suitcase on the bed. James's suits, crisp white shirts, and monogrammed cufflinks were strewn around haphazardly. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. The screen lit up with a text from James, leaving for Dubai in the morning. "Please ensure the penthouse is in order. We'll need to talk when I return." Sarah's anger simmered, overshadowed by the sinking reality that he referred to, we as if including Cassandra, was the most natural thing. She typed a response, something scathing about responsibility and their unborn child, but then her hands shook too much to press send. She tossed the phone onto the bed, tears burning her eyes, and sank onto the chaise lounge, numb. The next day, James left before dawn, accompanied by an entourage of assistants and a conspicuous absence of any apology or explanation. The hush that fell over the penthouse felt suffocating, a testament to a marriage cracking under the weight of betrayal. Sarah busied herself with practicalities, managing Margaret's home nurse schedule, organizing medical bills, and keeping up with prenatal classes. Yet a single question haunted her. How long could she endure this? During one of her appointments, Dr. Lisa Chen, a kind obstetrician at Mount Sinai, noticed Sarah's haggard appearance. "Your blood pressure is borderline high, Sarah. Stress can be detrimental," she warned. "Try to rest. Keep positive." But positivity was a commodity Sarah was rapidly running out of. She confided in Dr. Chen briefly, speaking about her mother-in-law's illness and the distant husband. Dr. Chen simply squeezed Sarah's hand and advised her to seek emotional support. "No matter how complicated your marriage gets, your baby needs you healthy." That evening, after leaving the hospital, Sarah decided to take a walk in Central Park. The looming bare trees and the crisp winter air offered a semblance of refuge from her unraveling life. She recalled simpler days before James's fortune overwhelmed her existence, late-night pizza slices in her tiny studio apartment, laughter shared with her best friend Alicia over silly rom-coms. A pang of longing washed over her. Perhaps she was naive to believe love alone could bridge the chasm of class differences, or that James could anchor himself to family when seduced by infinite luxury and desire. And yet, in this grim hour, Margaret clung to Sarah and her unborn child as a beacon of hope. If Margaret still believed in Sarah's worth, maybe that was enough to keep her going, at least for now. Little did Sarah realize that the storm was only beginning to gather, and soon it would threaten to tear apart everything she held dear. James's so-called business trip to Dubai stretched from days into a week, then nearly 2. During that time, tabloids erupted with tantalizing headlines. Real estate scion spotted in Seychelles with mystery woman James Harrington and Cassandra Locke in exclusive Maldives resort. Each new rumor pressed on Sarah's heart like a brutal weight. She tried to block out the noise, focusing on Margaret's recovery plan and her own baby's health. But every whisper threatened her fragile composure. Margaret, despite her deteriorating health, was not oblivious to the tabloid chatter. She had friends in high places, some of them privately emailed or called to express concern, or in some cases, to indulge in society gossip. Margaret, in her hospital bed, would grip her phone with trembling hands, eyes narrowed at the screen, reading the sensational stories about her son. The heartbreak etched lines of worry into her already pallid face. "I want James back here," Margaret insisted one afternoon. She spoke with a sudden force that reminded Sarah of the formidable matriarch she used to be. "He cannot behave like some entitled playboy while his wife is pregnant. I'll speak to him myself." Her voice quivered with a mix of anger and desperation. Sarah nodded, though her heart clenched at the thought of confronting James. Her attempts to reach him directly had been futile, unanswered calls, ignored texts. The Harrington family office was equally unhelpful, providing vague statements. Mr. Harrington is in transit. We'll pass along the message. Things took a sharper turn when Margaret's doctor recommended an urgent surgery. Her heart is too weak, Dr. Davies explained. We can stabilize her condition with medication, but the risk of a critical episode remains high unless we intervene. Sarah found herself in a maze of decisions, consenting for the procedure, coordinating with insurance, scheduling a top cardiac surgeon, Dr. Richard Blumenthal, known for complex valve replacements at Mount Sinai. Margaret insisted on only one condition: James had to be present. Fueled by the gravity of Margaret's condition, Sarah reached out to Alicia, her best friend from her pre-marriage days. Alicia worked in corporate events and had a knack for tracking people down, no matter how elusive. Over a frantic phone call, Sarah explained the situation: the mother-in-law's imminent surgery, James's disappearance with Cassandra, her own pregnancy stress. Alicia, outraged at James's behavior, promised to do everything she could. Within 48 hours, Alicia managed to glean that James was not in Dubai anymore. He had hopped to the Mediterranean, renting a mega yacht near the Greek Isles. She discovered a reliable contact, a yacht service manager at Piraeus port, who confirmed James had docked there briefly. Armed with this intel, Alicia made a barrage of calls, leaving messages everywhere from James's personal assistant to the yacht's management company. Tell Mr. Harrington his mother is scheduled for open-heart surgery in 3 days, Alicia said firmly. He is expected in New York immediately. On the second day of this frantic search, Sarah was in Margaret's hospital room when her phone buzzed. The caller ID read James. Her hand trembled as she answered, her voice carefully controlled. Yes, you and your friend have been harassing my staff, James snapped, his tone laced with condescension. What's so urgent that you can't respect my privacy for a single moment? Sarah inhaled, steadying herself. Your mother is scheduled for a life-saving surgery. She wants you here. Immediately, a tense silence filled the connection. James exhaled sharply. I'll see if I can arrange a flight, he said. No apology, no show of compassion. Sarah bristled but forced herself to remain calm. She's going under the knife in 3 days, James. You need to be here for her and for me. Before she could say more, he ended the call. Margaret, in her bed, watched Sarah's face, anxiety etched into her frail features. Is he coming? She asked weakly. Sarah pressed her lips together. He said he'd try. She took Margaret's hand, silently hoping that for once James's sense of responsibility would override his selfish impulses. The day of the surgery arrived with a thick tension in the air. The cardiology wing bustled with staff, preparing Margaret for the operation. Sarah, clad in a pale blue maternity sweater that stretched over her growing belly, paced the corridor. Dr. Blumenthal double-checked Margaret's vitals, offering a reassuring nod. Alicia arrived with a care package, hugging Sarah tight. He'll show, Alicia whispered. He has to. But minutes before Margaret was wheeled into the operating room, there was no sign of James. Margaret's eyes brimmed with disappointment, yet she tried to be brave. If I don't make it, she murmured to Sarah, promise me you'll protect this family. Promise me you'll ensure James doesn't lose his soul to all this. She gestured vaguely, perhaps meaning wealth or power or simply his destructive freedom. Tears rolled down Sarah's cheeks. You'll make it. You have to, she whispered, kissing Margaret's hand. The surgical team moved in, gently rolling Margaret away. Sarah stood in the hospital corridor, overwhelmed by the finality of the doors closing behind the gurney. She pressed a hand to her abdomen, feeling the soft flutter of her baby, her only source of comfort. Hours later, with the surgery in progress, Sarah felt a sudden commotion behind her. She turned, and there he was, James Harrington, hair tousled, suit jacket slung over his arm, face drawn with uncharacteristic tension. Cassandra was nowhere in sight. As their eyes locked, Sarah sensed a flicker of guilt in his expression, a spark of recognition that things had gone too far. But the moment was fleeting, overshadowed by months of anger and betrayal. No words passed between them as they sank into the plastic chairs of the waiting area. The harsh fluorescent lights illuminating the heartbreak etched onto Sarah's face. All they could do was wait, perhaps for a miracle, or perhaps for a reckoning they both knew was inevitable. Margaret's surgery lasted nearly 6 hours. While hospital staff moved with professional efficiency, time dragged mercilessly for Sarah, who clutched a styrofoam cup of lukewarm coffee she could barely stomach. Sitting next to her, James radiated a tense energy, legs jiggling anxiously. Occasionally, he glanced at Sarah's pregnant belly but said nothing. A sense of unreality washed over Sarah. Here she was, with her unfaithful husband, waiting to hear if his mother would survive. The silence between them felt like an impenetrable barrier. Finally, James cleared his throat. "I should have been here earlier," he said quietly, not quite meeting her gaze. Sarah closed her eyes, taking a moment to control her trembling voice. "Yes, you should have." His phone buzzed. He swiped it to silent without even checking. Normally, Sarah might have been relieved by this sign of respect, but she suspected he merely avoided Cassandra or the press. The hush resumed when Dr. Blumenthal emerged from the operating room. Sarah and James leapt to their feet. The surgeon's expression was guarded but not grim. "We've replaced the valve successfully," he said, removing his surgical cap. "It was complicated. Her heart is weak, and the next 48 hours are critical. But there's cause for optimism. She's stable." A wave of relief washed over Sarah, and tears sprang to her eyes. James's shoulders sagged as though a massive weight had lifted off him. "Thank you, doctor," he managed. They were allowed a brief visit to the ICU room, where Margaret lay unconscious, hooked up to a maze of tubes and monitors. Sarah approached the bed with careful steps, her hand trembling as she took Margaret's limp fingers in her own. The soft beeping of machines provided a fragile reassurance that life still coursed through Margaret's veins. James stood at the foot of the bed, silent, eyes flickering with an emotion Sarah couldn't decipher, remorse perhaps, or fear. The doctors instructed them that Margaret needed absolute rest, so Sarah returned to the waiting area while James lingered behind for a moment. As soon as he stepped out, his phone buzzed again. This time he answered it, muttering something about needing a few days, and it's complicated. Sarah guessed it was Cassandra, but she didn't press him. She was too emotionally drained to pick another fight. Over the next 24 hours, Sarah rarely left the hospital. She dozed in an uncomfortable chair, waking sporadically to check on Margaret or to guiltily nibble a sandwich Alicia brought. James, to his credit, remained on site as well, though he came and went from the hospital's VIP lounge. Sarah caught glimpses of him, talking heatedly on his phone, presumably pacifying business partners or perhaps Cassandra. On the second evening, Margaret was well enough to open her eyes briefly. Sarah was at her side in an instant. The older woman's gaze was cloudy, but she managed a faint smile upon seeing her son. "James," she whispered, voice raspy, "thank you for coming." James blinked, raw emotion stirring in his features. He took her hand gently, something Sarah had rarely witnessed him do. "I'm here, Mother," he murmured. "I'll be here." The next few days passed in a monotonous rhythm. Margaret's gradual recovery, Sarah's checkups, James's sporadic presence, and the hush of unspoken tensions. Dr. Blumenthal declared the operation a success, though Margaret's rehab would be lengthy. She would likely need months of close monitoring, physical therapy, and minimal stress. Once Margaret was stable enough to be moved from the ICU to a private room, James insisted on an extravagant arrangement: fresh white orchids from the Waldorf Astoria florist, a specialized meal plan from a private chef, and a swath of top-notch nurses on rotation. Sarah watched in silence on one hand, relieved he was finally showing care, on the other, bitterly aware that part of his display was to quell guilt or maintain appearances. Late one night, as Sarah stood by a window in Margaret's new room, James stepped in, quietly shutting the door. "We need to talk," he said, voice tight. She turned to face him. Under the dim hospital lights, the lines of strain and anxiety on his face were unmistakable. This was a man torn between love, or what once passed for it, and a reckless desire that had led him astray. "Sarah, I know you're upset about everything." His gaze skittered away, then returned. "But let's be honest, we've been drifting apart. You're always consumed with pregnancy and my mother's health. I just needed a break." His words, so casual, ignited Sarah's simmering anger. "You needed a break?" she echoed. "You left me alone to handle your mother's critical illness while gallivanting with your mistress, James. This isn't just about drifting apart. It's about you refusing to own up to your responsibilities." He winced at her bluntness. For a moment his face softened. "I never wanted to hurt you," he said, voice tinged with regret. "I just felt smothered by everything. We were so happy at first, Sarah, but once the pregnancy came and my mother fell ill, I panicked." She pressed a hand against the ache in her chest. "And Cassandra? Is she just some coping mechanism?" He hesitated. "I care about her in a different way. But that doesn't mean I want a divorce," he added hastily, as if that alone solved everything. "We can work this out. I promise I'll be more present." Sarah's mind spun, trapped between heartbreak and the memory of vows once made. She thought of her unborn child, who deserved a stable family, if that was even possible now. With tears threatening to spill, she shook her head. "I need time to think, James. You can't just waltz in after months of betrayal and expect me to believe everything will be fine." James nodded slowly, stepping back, his face a mix of relief that she hadn't outright ended the marriage and frustration that he wasn't immediately forgiven. "Take all the time you need," he murmured, turning to leave. Before he stepped out, he glanced at Margaret's sleeping form. "I'll do better. For her. For us." He left Sarah standing there, a swirl of emotions roiling inside her. His promises felt hollow, yet part of her yearned to believe him. The future lay wide open, uncertain and fraught, just like the quiet hush of the hospital corridors stretching into the night. In the weeks that followed Margaret's surgery, Sarah and James fell into a cautious dance around each other. Out of concern for Margaret's fragile condition, they kept their disputes muted, presenting a facade of unity whenever they visited her in the hospital. Margaret, elated by her son's renewed presence, seemed to recover faster. Physical therapists guided her through gentle exercises, nurses administered medications, and Dr. Blumenthal complimented her resilience. Meanwhile, Sarah juggled her prenatal appointments, now well into her third trimester, and the orchestrations for Margaret's eventual discharge. She hired a specialized caregiver named Janice, recommended by a friend of Margaret's from the Mount Sinai Volunteer Board. Janice had extensive experience with cardiac patients, and her calm demeanor soothed Margaret's occasional anxiety. James, for his part, made an effort to appear attentive. He scaled back some travel, made phone calls from the hospital lounge instead of his private jet, and even joined Sarah for a few short walks around Central Park, though the tension between them remained. Cassandra's name lingered unspoken, but her presence was far from erased. Late-night calls would occasionally light up James's phone, and Sarah noticed the flicker of guilt on his face whenever he answered. She never asked, and he never volunteered explanations. One breezy afternoon, Margaret was deemed stable enough to return to the penthouse. She arrived in a wheelchair, though she insisted she could walk, if only the doctors allowed. The staff had prepared her suite on the penthouse's second floor, transforming it into a mini medical sanctuary. Monitors, medication charts, and an adjustable bed replaced the typical decor. Sarah hovered, anxious to ensure everything ran smoothly. James took on the role of host, showing nurses the layout, adjusting the temperature, ordering an elaborate welcome-home feast that Margaret could barely eat due to dietary restrictions. That evening, as the Harrington household settled into this new normal, Sarah found herself alone in the cozy study with Margaret. The older woman was propped up on a recliner, a warm blanket draped over her legs, sipping herbal tea. She gestured for Sarah to sit beside her. "I've been thinking a lot during my time in the hospital," Margaret began, her voice low. "You've been a blessing, dear. I may not have shown it in the beginning, but you've proven yourself in ways I never anticipated." Her gaze softened. "I also know my son has made mistakes, grievous mistakes." A lump formed in Sarah's throat. "Margaret, the first," she started, but the older woman raised a hand gently. "I don't need all the details, child. I've been around long enough to see the pattern. James runs from responsibility when it closes in. He's terrified of being tethered." She paused, swirling the tea in her cup. "That doesn't absolve him of blame, of course. But I do believe, deep down, he loves you. He just doesn't know how to navigate the real substance of marriage." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She had never heard Margaret speak so plainly about her son's flaws. "I'm just so tired," Sarah whispered. "I can't keep being the only one trying." Margaret reached for Sarah's hand. "Then don't be," she said. "Stand firm. Demand he give you the respect you deserve. If he refuses, you have your child to think of. You shouldn't sacrifice your own well-being for his folly." In that moment, Sarah felt a pang of gratitude and sorrow. Margaret was right. She had to decide if James was truly willing to change, or if she would have to face single parenthood. The weight of that decision pressed on her heavily, especially as she inched closer to her due date. Days melted into each other, with Sarah assisting Margaret's rehabilitation and preparing for the baby's arrival. She tried to maintain civility with James. Occasionally, they shared a quiet dinner, during which he spoke about the Harrington Empire and how his father had once expanded their real estate portfolio into Europe. He reminisced about his childhood, the pressure he felt to live up to the Harrington name. On rare occasions, he even apologized. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I really am." Yet each apology felt like a half-step, overshadowed by the knowledge that Cassandra's shadow lingered somewhere beyond the gilded walls. One night, Sarah woke to an empty bed. Concerned, she padded down the corridor, eventually hearing James's voice from the living room. Through the half-open door, she saw him pacing, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was tense, subdued. "Cassandra, I can't talk about this now. No, she doesn't know I'm calling you." "Yes, I understand." Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth, heart racing. She retreated before he could notice. Back in bed, she bit her lip to stifle the tears. She thought of Margaret's words, "Stand firm, demand respect." Yet how to do that without fracturing an already fragile household? The following morning, Margaret's nurse, Janice, mentioned a trip to Boston for a specialized checkup recommended by Dr. Blumenthal. "He wants a second opinion on her post-op progress," Janice explained. "We could drive or take a short flight, but it's recommended soon." Sarah floated the idea to Margaret, who agreed. "If it helps me regain strength, I'll do it," she said bravely. James, however, immediately insisted on traveling with them, chartering a private plane, ensuring the best suite at the Four Seasons Hotel in Boston. Sarah bristled at the extravagance, but Margaret smiled. "Let him. He wants to help now. Don't push him away." And so it was settled, a family trip to Boston for Margaret's medical consultation. Sarah prayed it might be a chance for James to prove he could be present, to show real commitment to healing both his mother's health and the fractured bonds of their marriage. Quietly, she harbored a kernel of hope that, just maybe, the man she fell in love with could be salvaged from the wreckage of his own failings. But destiny had other plans, and no one in the Harrington clan was prepared for the trials that would unfold in the city on a hill. The flight to Boston was uneventful, which was precisely what Sarah had hoped for. Margaret reclined in a leather seat aboard the Harrington family's private jet, carefully monitored by Janice. Sarah sat across from them, skimming a parenting book titled Bringing Up BB, recommended by Alicia. She found herself occasionally glancing at James, who busied himself on his laptop, presumably finalizing deals or reading financial reports. Despite the tension undercurrents, they landed smoothly at Boston Logan International Airport and were whisked by limousine to the Four Seasons Hotel near Back Bay. Margaret's condition necessitated an accessible suite, so James had arranged for a large, luxurious one with a separate living area. The city's crisp autumn air and golden foliage offered a fleeting sense of renewal, a picturesque backdrop to the hope that maybe this trip would bring them closer to unity. The following morning, they arrived at Massachusetts General Hospital for Margaret's evaluation. Dr. Alistair Patel, an esteemed cardiologist recommended by Dr. Blumenthal, conducted a series of thorough tests. While Margaret was in the examination room, Sarah sat in the waiting area, her swollen ankles propped on a footrest. She closed her eyes, mentally rehearsing questions about Margaret's medication and therapy schedule. James, restless, paced the corridor. He paused to check his phone. When it buzzed, he quickly retreated down the hallway, out of earshot. Sarah's heart sank. Each time he took a call in private, she wondered if it was Cassandra on the other end. The cycle of suspicion exhausted her. Miss S. Harrington, a nurse, poked her head out. Dr. Patel will meet with you and your husband now to discuss Margaret's condition. Inside the office, Dr. Patel was reassuring. Margaret's heart function had improved since surgery, though she needed vigilant monitoring and possibly a new medication regimen. Keep her stress levels low and encourage light exercise, Dr. Patel advised, handing Sarah a pamphlet of guidelines. Overall, she's doing well for someone who underwent such a major procedure. Relief washed over Sarah. James nodded, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Thank you, doctor," he said, sounding genuinely grateful. For a moment, Sarah caught a glimpse of the caring partner she once knew. Back at the hotel, Margaret opted for a rest. James suggested they take a walk along the Charles River Esplanade, a surprising gesture. Sarah agreed, albeit hesitantly. The two strolled side by side, the crunchy fall leaves underfoot. The scenic beauty offered a moment's reprieve from their strained relationship. They found a bench overlooking the water, and James sat down, inhaling the crisp air. "We haven't really talked in a while," he began. His tone was softer than usual. "I'm trying, Sarah." She studied his profile, noting the slight creases at the corners of his eyes. "What exactly are you trying, James? To be a better husband, or to keep me around so there's no scandal?" Her words came out sharper than intended, but the pain she harbored refused to be silenced. He looked wounded. "It's not just about scandal. I do care about you, us. I'm not proud of how I've behaved." He paused. "I can't promise to be perfect overnight, but I'm willing to make changes." Sarah's eyes stung with tears. "I want to believe you, but you're still communicating with Cassandra. Don't deny it. I see how you hide your calls." James's jaw tightened. "It's complicated. She invests in some of my ventures. Breaking things off isn't just personal, it's also business. But I promise, it's winding down." His explanation felt like a half-truth, yet some part of Sarah, desperate for stability, clung to it. "I'm nearing the end of this pregnancy," she reminded him. "I need to feel safe." "Emotional whiplash isn't safe," he nodded, hesitating. "I know. You have every right to be angry. Let's just see if we can get through Margaret's recovery. When we return to New York, I'll clarify things with Cassandra once and for all." They walked back in silence, a tenuous ceasefire that neither dared break. Sarah prayed that James would follow through, but her instincts cautioned otherwise. That evening, Alicia called, excited to share some baby shower ideas. "We could do it at the Carlisle Hotel, or maybe a quaint rooftop in Brooklyn," she suggested. Sarah's heart warmed at the thought of celebrating her impending motherhood with a friend who genuinely cared. But as she looked around the lavish four-season suite, hearing Margaret's soft snores from the bedroom, she wondered if the celebration would be overshadowed by the fiasco that was her marriage. The next morning, Dr. Patel announced that Margaret's tests were all set and they could return to New York whenever they wished. With that, James arranged for a return flight. As they prepared to leave the hotel, Sarah noticed the tension etched on James's face again. "Are you okay?" she asked. He forced a smile. "Just some real estate issues in London. I need to handle them quickly." They boarded the private jet that afternoon, Margaret comfortably resting under Janice's watchful eye. Sarah felt the baby move again, a reassuring swirl reminding her that she had more than just her heartbreak to focus on. She glanced out the window at the Boston skyline, trying to quell the gnawing unease that James's promises were empty. In her heart, she knew that if James didn't truly cut ties with Cassandra or find a genuine transformation, the facade would crumble. And if it did, she would have to gather the courage to face an uncharted future one where she might stand alone with her child, but at least stand with dignity intact. Upon returning to New York, Sarah threw herself into the final preparations for the baby's arrival. She was now in her 8th month, and every day felt heavier, both physically and emotionally. Margaret settled back into the penthouse, continuing her cardiac rehabilitation. Janice coordinated with local therapists and doctors, ensuring a seamless transition from the Boston care plan. James, to Sarah's tentative relief, seemed more present. He joined her for a prenatal class at Mount Sinai, an awkward experience for a man who usually delegated tasks rather than participating. They practiced breathing techniques, and at one point James stood behind Sarah, his hands gently cradling her belly as the instructor guided them. For a fleeting moment, Sarah felt a connection, a reminder of why she'd fallen in love with him. But reality intruded soon enough. A week later, a rumor spread that Cassandra Locke had been spotted at Bergdorf Goodman in Midtown, apparently bragging about an upcoming trip to Switzerland with James. Sarah confronted him in the living room. "Explain," she demanded, arms crossed protectively over her pregnant stomach. James looked exasperated. "She's delusional, Sarah. I told her things are over, but she refuses to accept it. I can't control what she says to the press." Frustration welled up inside Sarah. Was that truly the case, or was he playing both sides? Margaret, awakened by the heated voices, entered the living room, leaning on her cane. The older woman's gaze flicked between her son and Sarah. "Not in my house," Margaret said quietly, her voice stern. "James, this has to stop. You can't keep dragging Sarah through this." He nodded, shamefaced. "I'm trying, Mother." In the subsequent days, James made another show of cutting ties, blocking Cassandra's number, telling his personal assistant to direct any of her calls to the family lawyer. Sarah watched warily, waiting for the next slip-up. Margaret watched too, her eyes filled with a painful awareness that her son was on the precipice of losing everything. Meanwhile, the baby shower Alicia organized. True to her lively spirit, Alicia booked a charming rooftop garden at the Refinery Hotel in Midtown, complete with pastel balloon arches, a dessert bar brimming with macarons, and a cozy corner for gifts. Sarah wore a flowing lavender gown that draped over her belly. Margaret attended in a comfortable but elegant ensemble, offering occasional grateful smiles to the well-wishers who told her how relieved they were about her improving health. James showed up late, blaming a business meeting. He arrived with a lavish gift, a custom-designed crib from a designer in Italy. Sarah forced a polite smile, accepting his kiss on the cheek. The guests, mostly Sarah's friends and a few of Margaret's close acquaintances, eyed the couple with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. The tabloids had not been kind to them, and rumor had it that Cassandra's name still loomed behind every philanthropic function or society event where James might appear. In a private moment, Alicia pulled Sarah aside. "How are you really holding up?" she asked, concern evident in her gaze. Sarah exhaled slowly. "I'm scared," she admitted. "If I weren't pregnant, I might have left by now. But everything's so complicated. And James keeps promising changes." Alicia squeezed her hand. "You deserve real happiness, Sarah, not half-truths. Remember that." As the baby shower concluded, James approached Sarah, who was chatting with an old college friend. He guided her away gently. "Let's take a photo with the crib," he suggested. She obliged, standing next to him while the photographer snapped pictures. For that instant, they looked like a blissful couple, soon-to-be parents filled with excitement. Yet Sarah felt a pang of hollowness. She wondered if their public display of togetherness was more for show than genuine affection. That evening, after guests departed and the penthouse quieted, Sarah returned to her suite, exhausted. James followed her in, removing his tie. Just want to say I'm proud of you," he said, eyes flickering with vulnerability. "How you handled the shower, how you've been so strong for my mother." Sarah's throat tightened. She wanted to melt into his arms, to believe him, but doubts clung to her like a second skin. "Thank you," she said simply. They stood there, facing each other across the room. The silence swelled, filled with unspoken questions. Would James truly commit to being a faithful husband and father? Could Sarah forgive the betrayal and trust him again? Eventually, James turned to leave. On his way out, he paused at the door, glancing back at her. His lips parted, as though he were about to confess something, but then he merely shook his head. "Good night, Sarah." The door clicked shut, leaving her alone in the soft glow of the bedside lamp. No matter how much they tried to patch things up, Sarah sensed that an unhealed wound festered beneath the surface. The final test of their relationship was quickly approaching. Her due date was only a few weeks away, and with it would come the biggest challenge and potential joy of their lives. If James was ever going to prove he could be the partner she needed, it would have to be soon. Otherwise, motherhood might be a path she would walk alone. As Sarah neared her due date, nights became increasingly restless. Her back ached, her swollen feet throbbed, and the baby's frequent movements left her gasping for comfortable positions. Margaret's recovery was progressing, though she still needed Janice's help for routine activities. Tension between James and Sarah remained, though they maintained a truce in the presence of Margaret's delicate health. One late evening, as Sarah attempted to ease her discomfort by strolling around the penthouse's ornate living room, she heard the elevator chime. It was past 11, and she wasn't expecting visitors. A moment later, Cassandra Locke sauntered in, flanked by a startled concierge. The sight of that statuesque figure, clad in a designer trench coat and stilettos, made Sarah's blood run cold. "Miss." Locke insisted she had urgent business with Mr. Harrington. The concierge stammered. I tried to stop her, but Cassandra breezed past him, eyes blazing. "Where is James?" she demanded, voice echoing in the marble-clad foyer. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. She wondered if James had secretly invited her here, unthinkable. But who knew? A door to the study opened, and James emerged. His face fell the moment he saw Cassandra. "What are you doing here?" he asked, struggling to maintain composure. Cassandra's lips curled into a bitter smile. "I got tired of your brush-offs. We need to talk business deals, money owed, the works. You think you can block my calls and expect me to vanish?" She flicked her gaze to Sarah's pregnant form, eyes narrowing. "Hello, Sarah. The first see you're still the dutiful wife." Sarah's skin prickled with adrenaline. She turned to James, voice quavering. "Why is she here, James? You said you ended it." James shot Cassandra a warning glare. "I told you not to come," he hissed. "We could have handled this in my office tomorrow privately." Cassandra let out a mocking laugh. "Oh, please, you've been ducking me for weeks. I'm done with your excuses. You owe me a share of the profit from that London property flip, and I intend to collect." She pointed an accusatory finger at Sarah. "He used my capital on one of his ventures, you know. Bet he never told you about that." Sarah felt a sense of betrayal twist inside her. James had assured her any ties with Cassandra were severed, both personal and professional. But this new revelation suggested otherwise. Tensions ignited. The staff hovered uncomfortably at the periphery, uncertain if they should intervene. James gestured to the study. "Fine, we'll talk, but not out here." He shot Sarah a look that teetered between apology and desperation before he and Cassandra disappeared into the study, shutting the door. Time crawled as Sarah stood in the foyer, hands pressed protectively against her belly. Her breath came in shaky bursts. Should she barge in, demand the truth? Confronting them might escalate into a shouting match, which was the last thing she needed this close to her due date. Instead, she paced, trying to remain calm. Margaret and Janice, awakened by the commotion, emerged from the corridor. Margaret's eyes hardened. "Cassandra is here?" she asked, voice laced with fury. Sarah nodded. The older woman signaled Janice to help her toward the living room. They sat quietly, waiting. At last, the study door swung open with a bang. Cassandra strode out, clutching her purse, face flushed with anger. "You'll regret this, James," she spat. "Don't think you can cheat me." With that, she stormed toward the elevator, leaving behind a charged silence. James stepped out, shoulders slumped, eyes heavy with shame. "It's complicated," he said hoarsely. "She's threatening to sue unless I pay her share from that real estate deal." Margaret's voice cut through. "And you thought it wise to keep this from your wife, especially after all the trouble you've caused." She paused, her glare piercing. "James, I'm done making excuses for you. This household can't endure your deception any longer." Sarah found her voice trembling. "You lied again, James. I asked you repeatedly if there were any loose ends with Cassandra, and you said no." She felt tears burning her eyes. "We're about to have a baby. Why can't you be honest?" James opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked like a cornered animal, grappling with guilt. Finally, he rubbed his forehead. "I didn't want to burden you," he whispered. "The deal with Cassandra was purely business at first, but it got messy. I thought I could handle it without dragging you into it. I never meant for her to show up here." Margaret shook her head in disgust. "You've humiliated this family, James. No more." Sarah's mind spun. The stress, the betrayal, everything collided. Her breathing grew rapid, and a searing pain shot through her abdomen. She gasped, clutching her belly. Janice rushed forward, alarmed. "Sarah, are you all right?" The pain intensified, radiating through her lower back. Her knees buckled, and she felt a rush of fluid. Terror seized her. She was barely 37 weeks. Was this labor starting? "James," she choked, panic flaring in her eyes. James snapped out of his stupor, rushing to support her. Margaret called for the driver to bring the car around. Janice, a retired nurse, quickly checked Sarah's pulse. "We need to get her to the hospital now." In the whirlwind that followed, the staff scrambled to gather Sarah's hospital bag, which fortunately Alicia had insisted she pack weeks ago. James and Janice helped Sarah down to the waiting car, while Margaret, despite her own frailty, insisted on coming too. As the vehicle sped through the Manhattan streets toward Mount Sinai, Sarah clung to James's arm. Pain and fear battled within her, but another emotion rose to the surface: resignation. In this cataclysmic moment, she realized that whether or not James truly changed, she had to protect herself and her child. This might be the final straw that broke the fragile facade of their marriage. Only time would tell if James would rise to the occasion, or if the child's birth would mark the end of a love story gone terribly awry. It was past midnight when they arrived at Mount Sinai. The maternity ward bustled with hurried efficiency, nurses guiding Sarah into a delivery room. Her contractions were fast and furious, far more intense than the preliminary cramps she'd experienced weeks earlier. Dr. Lisa Chen, the obstetrician who had followed Sarah's pregnancy, appeared within minutes. Her expression poised with professional calm. Sarah's world dissolved into a haze of pain and adrenaline. James hovered at her side, face pale, offering sips of water and murmured encouragement. Margaret, constrained by her own frailty, sat in a wheelchair just outside the room, praying softly. In halting whispers, Sarah demanded that someone call Alicia, who rushed to the hospital at once, disheveled but determined to support her friend. The labor stretched on for hours, an exhausting ordeal that left Sarah drenched in sweat. Back arching each time a contraction tore through her body, she clutched James's hand in a death grip. In those moments, the betrayal and heartbreak dimmed, eclipsed by the primal urge to bring their child safely into the world. James, tears glistening in his eyes, tried to reassure her, "You're doing great, Sarah. I'm here. Even so, part of Sarah's mind remained guarded, aware that once this ordeal was over, reality would crash back down. Cassandra's dramatic intrusion, the lies James told, and the constant weight of mistrust would still be waiting. But for now, the immediate challenge of childbirth commanded her entire being. By dawn, the baby's heartbeat played like a steady drum on the monitors. Dr. Chen announced, "You're fully dilated, Sarah. It's time to push." The next few minutes were a tumult of agony and effort. A final, raw scream tore from Sarah's throat, and then, in a rush of movement and emotion, she heard a sharp, beautiful cry fill the room. "It's a boy!" Dr. Chen declared, holding up the newborn. Tears streamed down Sarah's face. She sagged back onto the pillows, overwhelmed by relief and awe. The nurse placed the tiny, wailing infant on her chest. Sarah's heart swelled with indescribable love as she gazed at the scrunched red face of her son. James hovered, tears slipping down his cheeks unchecked. "He's perfect," he whispered. Margaret, rolled in by Alicia, peeked from the doorway, a shaky smile transforming her features. "My grandson," she breathed. "My precious grandson." Even in her weakened state, she radiated pride. For a moment, the room glowed with unity. James pressed a gentle kiss to Sarah's forehead, his lips trembling. Alicia and Dr. Chen exchanged soft smiles. The baby, swaddled in a warm blanket, let out plaintive little noises, and Sarah felt like her entire life had led to this singular moment of raw, unfiltered joy. Yet the respite was short-lived. Not long after, Margaret was taken to a lounge area to rest, and Sarah's postpartum checks began. While the medical team attended to her vitals, James stepped outside to make a phone call. Whether it was business or otherwise, Sarah couldn't tell. She found herself trembling, both from the aftershocks of labor and the realization that her future remained precarious. The newborn was carried to the nursery for routine tests. Alicia, her face glowing, squeezed Sarah's hand. "He's beautiful," she said softly. "You did amazing." Sarah nodded, tears forming again, this time from exhaustion and the swirl of emotions. "Alicia," she whispered, "I'm scared. What if James doesn't change? I can't raise my son in a toxic environment." Alicia's eyes hardened with protective resolve. Then you leave, Sarah. You have options: my apartment, legal counsel. Don't stay in a marriage that hurts you. Your son needs a strong mother. Before Sarah could reply, James returned. His shoulders sagged, and he looked oddly vulnerable. Sarah, he began, voice thick, I told Cassandra to never contact me again. I'm settling her financial claims to be done with her. For real this time. She eyed him warily. You expect me to believe you just like that? He swallowed. I know trust isn't immediate, but holding our son, his voice choked up. It changed something in me. I want to be a real husband, a real father. Sarah felt a flicker of hope stir, but also caution. Too many times he'd promised to cut ties, to change, and each time she'd found new deceptions. I need to see action, James, not just words, she said softly. He nodded. I know. Whatever it takes, I'll do it. In that moment, their baby was wheeled back in, clean and swaddled, a small band on his wrist reading Baby Boy Harrington. James carefully lifted him, a mixture of awe and determination shining in his eyes. Perhaps fatherhood could spark the redemption he claimed to seek. Or perhaps he would falter once again, lost in the labyrinth of wealth and desire. Sarah, cradling her newborn, resolved to stand by her earlier decision. If James truly changed, she would open her heart again. If not, she would gather the strength to leave for the sake of her son. For now, she chose to revel in this tender, fleeting moment, motherhood's warmth surging through her like a shield against the uncertainties that lay ahead. In the hush of Mount Sinai Hospital, as new life was welcomed and old wounds lingered, Sarah found a kernel of hope in the face of heartbreak. The birth of her son offered a chance for James to redeem himself, to sever ties with betrayal and embrace the responsibilities of fatherhood. Margaret, frail yet steadfast, watched her grandson's arrival as a testament that even the deepest rifts could be healed if love and accountability triumphed. Thank you for joining us on this emotionally charged journey of devotion, deceit, and the possibility of forgiveness. If Sarah's struggle and resilience touched your heart, please like this video, share it with friends who crave a gripping real-life drama, and subscribe to our channel to explore more riveting stories. Your support helps us continue illuminating the hidden corners of human relationships. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.